The afternoon started like any other Tuesday in our Richmond suburb until I heard my wife's voice from the driveway, calm as ever, saying, "You have exactly 5 seconds to lower that weapon before I demonstrate what 12 years in Delta Force teaches about threat neutralization." I looked out the window to see Kiple Gant, our neighborhood self-appointed security enforcer, holding what looked like a pistol while my wife Julia stood perfectly still next to her car, groceries still in hand. What happened next took less than 3 seconds. The gun was on the ground, Kiple was screaming about his wrist, and somehow he'd ended up zip-tied to our decorative garden gnome. That's when I knew the HOA had finally crossed a line they couldn't uncross. Let me back up and explain how we got here. My name's Mark Meyers, and I'm a 43-year-old data analyst who works from home and minds his own business. My wife Julia and I moved to Cypress Trails 3 years ago, drawn by the good schools and quiet streets. The neighborhood seemed perfect at first, all manicured lawns and friendly waves from porches. Sure, there was an HOA, but we figured as long as we kept our grass trimmed and didn't paint the house neon pink, we'd be fine. We didn't count on Veronica Blaze becoming HOA president 6 months after we arrived. Veronica was the kind of woman who measured grass height with an actual ruler and once tried to fine our elderly neighbor for having a bird feeder that attracted non-approved avian species. But Veronica wasn't our biggest problem. That honor went to Kiple Gant, a 30-something wannabe cop who Veronica had hired as the neighborhood's security compliance officer. Nobody knew where she found him, though rumors suggested Craigslist was involved. Kiple showed up to his first day wearing a tactical vest covered in patches he'd clearly bought online, wraparound sunglasses even on cloudy days, and a laminated badge he'd made himself that said, "Captain Gant, HOA Security Division." He carried a clipboard everywhere and spoke into a walkie-talkie that we all suspected wasn't connected to anything. At first, he was just annoying, leaving passive-aggressive notes about minor violations that didn't actually exist. The harassment started small but escalated quickly. First came the notes taped to our mailbox. American flag appears to be hanging 1.5 inches below regulation height. This disrespects our nation. Then, observed female resident performing calisthenics on front lawn. Possible paramilitary training activity. And my personal favorite, grill smoke detected drifting into neighboring airspace without proper wind variance permit. I thought they were jokes at first. Julia knew better. She dealt with actual threats in Afghanistan and Iraq, and she recognized the pattern of someone testing boundaries, seeing how far they could push before meeting resistance. The early morning patrols were next. Kiple would walk past our house at 5:30 a.m., sometimes stopping to take photos of our property with a camera that had a lens longer than my forearm. He'd mutter fake codes into his dead walkie-talkie loud enough for us to hear through our bedroom window. Unit 1 to base. Observing Myers' residence. No visible violations at this time, but maintaining surveillance. Julia started jogging at different times to avoid him, but he'd adjust his schedule to match hers. One morning he actually followed her for 3 blocks, shouting, "Ma'am, you're under HOA observation for suspicious fitness activities." Julia just smiled and waved. I think that smile convinced him he was winning. The situation deteriorated over the next 2 months. Kiple started showing up at odd hours, measuring our mailbox height, checking our trash can placement with a protractor, and photographing our cars from multiple angles. He filed 17 different violation notices with the HOA board, each more ridiculous than the last. We contested every single one and won, which only seemed to make him angrier. Veronica backed him completely, even creating new rules specifically targeting us. Suddenly there were regulations about the acceptable volume of dinner conversations that could be heard through open windows and restrictions on how many times per week we could start our cars before 8 a.m. Everything changed that Wednesday afternoon. Julia had just returned from Costco with our weekly groceries when she found Kiple standing in our driveway, arms crossed like he was guarding a military checkpoint. She parked and got out calmly, already sensing something was different about this encounter. "You're in violation of Neighborhood Code 4B, he announced, his hand moving to his hip. "That diagonal parking demonstrates hostile intent toward HOA authority." Julia told me later she noticed his hand trembling as he reached under his tactical vest. That's when he pulled out what looked like a Glock 19 and pointed it directly at her. Here's what Kiple didn't know about my wife. Julia served 5 combat tours in Afghanistan and Iraq with Delta Force. She has a wall of commendations in our home office that she never talks about. She once disarmed an armed insurgent in Kandahar using nothing but a mess hall spatula and her training. She can run a 6-minute mile in full gear and has more confirmed kills than she'll ever discuss. But most importantly, she has the kind of muscle memory that turns violent confrontation into pure instinct. Kiple thought he was intimidating a suburban housewife. He was actually threatening one of the most lethal human beings in Virginia. What happened next was both beautiful and terrifying to watch. Julia dropped her groceries slowly, keeping her hands visible, and spoke in that eerily calm voice she uses when she's about to do something decisive. You have exactly 5 seconds to lower that weapon before I demonstrate what 12 years in Delta Force teaches about threat neutralization. Kiple laughed nervously and kept the gun raised. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I barely saw her move. One moment she was standing by her car, the next she had control of his weapon arm. The gun went flying into our flower bed. There was a sound like a branch snapping, which turned out to be Kiple's wrist dislocating. He screamed and dropped to his knees. Somehow, and I still don't know where she got them from, Julia had zip ties and had secured him to our 3-foot-tall garden gnome before he even stopped yelling. I called 911 while Julia calmly picked up her groceries and put them on the porch. The actual police arrived within minutes, and the scene they found was almost comical. Kiple was crying, demanding they arrest Julia for assault while still zip-tied to a gnome covered in fake snow. He kept waving his HOA badge at them with his good hand, not realizing it still had a Pokemon sticker on it from some joke someone had played weeks earlier. The officers took one look at the gun in our flower bed, listened to Julia's calm explanation of events, and immediately put Kiple in handcuffs. Well, one handcuff. His other wrist was too swollen. That's when things got really interesting. As the police ran Kiple's information, they discovered this wasn't his first incident. He'd been removed from 3 other HOA positions across Virginia for similar behavior, including one where he tried to citizens arrest a mailman for trespassing on HOA property. He wasn't licensed to carry a firearm, the gun wasn't registered, and impersonating a law enforcement officer is a felony in Virginia. Veronica showed up halfway through his arrest, screaming about HOA authority and threatening to sue everyone present. The lead officer calmly informed her that hiring someone to carry a weapon and police residence could make her criminally liable as well. The emergency HOA meeting 3 days later was standing room only. Half the neighborhood showed up, most having their own stories about Kiple's harassment. Julia had prepared a presentation she titled Suburban Counterterrorism, How I Neutralized a Domestic HOA Threat in 2 minutes and 14 seconds. She'd made actual handouts with diagrams. Veronica tried to prevent her from speaking, banging her gavel and shouting about proper procedures. Julia walked up to the podium, took the gavel from Veronica's hand, and snapped it in half with one swift motion. The room went dead silent. What followed was the most comprehensive destruction of an HOA administration I've ever witnessed. Julia presented evidence of 23 different instances where Kiple had violated actual law, not HOA rules. She showed security camera footage from multiple neighbors who'd been recording his behavior for months. She produced receipts showing Veronica had used HOA funds to purchase Kiple's tactical equipment, including something called a Liberty drone that cost $2,000 and was supposedly for aerial compliance monitoring. 3 board members resigned on the spot. Veronica's own husband stood up and made a motion to remove her as president. The vote was unanimous. Even Veronica's closest allies abandoned her when Julia revealed Kiple had been hired through a Craigslist ad that promised military-style neighborhood enforcement, and that Veronica had known about his previous incidents but hired him anyway. Someone found the original ad on Veronica's computer, which he'd foolishly saved in a folder labeled HOA Secret Projects. It turned out she'd been planning to expand the program, with 2 more enforcement officers already interviewed. The police investigation that followed uncovered even more disturbing details. Kiple had been keeping files on every resident, including photos of children walking to school and detailed schedules of when people left for work. He had a mannequin in his apartment dressed in tactical gear that he'd named Deputy Justice. Veronica had given him a master key to the neighborhood's common areas and was planning to install cameras in the playground. The county prosecutor took one look at the evidence and filed charges for criminal conspiracy, misuse of HOA funds, and harassment. At Kiple's arraignment 2 weeks later, He showed up in a neck brace, arm sling, and walking boot, none of which our lawyer said were medically necessary. He tried to claim diplomatic immunity as an HOA officer, which the judge said was the stupidest thing I've heard in 30 years on the bench. He was charged with assault with a deadly weapon, impersonating an officer, criminal threatening, and stalking. His public defender looked like he wanted to be anywhere else as Kiple insisted on representing himself halfway through and started citing HOA bylaws as if they were federal law. Veronica's downfall was even more complete. The forensic accountant the new HOA board hired found she'd embezzled over $15,000 for her security initiative. She'd been billing the HOA for Kiple's salary, his equipment, and even his gas money for the patrols. She'd also been fining residents and pocketing the money directly instead of putting it in the HOA account. When confronted with the evidence at her criminal trial, she tried to claim it was all for neighborhood safety and that Julia was actually a terrorist trying to infiltrate the community. The trials were swift and decisive. Kiple got 18 months in federal prison, 3 years probation, and was permanently banned from working in any security capacity. He also had to pay $5,000 in fines and restitution. When the sentence was read, he stood up and screamed that the HOA would hear about this, apparently forgetting he'd already been permanently banned from all HOA properties in Virginia. Veronica received 6 months in jail, 2 years probation, and had to pay back $22,000 in restitution and fines. She collapsed in the courtroom when the judge announced she was also banned from serving on any HOA board for life, screaming, "But I am the HOA," as bailiffs carried her out.